enterocolitis, which is a form of large intestine inflammation. So that's not to say that there's a definitive answer. I guess I could put it that way. But in my own private practice, it's been my experience that when we just cut out the classic grains, people get better for a short period of time, 2, 3, 6 months, and then their condition starts to digress. And what we see is that what they end up doing is they end up going to the gluten-free pasta, the gluten-free cookies, the gluten-free crackers, all the different products that are available, and they're still getting gluten, and potentially they either are getting cross-contamination, meaning that the products that are being made, even though they're claiming to be gluten-free, have cross-contamination, or it's the gluten that's found in those grains that just hasn't been well enough studied, or it could also be some of the genetic modification, or it could also be the fact that many of these products are not organic and they're exposed to high amounts of fungicides, fumigants, insecticides, and other chemicals. So nobody has that definitive answer. And so when I try to put the research out there as it is and make commentary on it, and my advice is to go grain-free more so than it is specifically wheat, barley, rye, and oats-free, simply because of my own practical experience in treating patients for the last 10 years. I've diagnosed over 2,000 patients. And in every single case, when we cut out grain, they do infinitely better than when they just cut out wheat, barley, and rye.
And are you talking, when you talk about grain, for example, is quinoa included in that class?
Quinoa is not a grain. Quinoa, amaranth, and buckwheat are not grains. And these are the kind of the three pseudo grains that they're actually from a different type of a plant. So they're not technically in the same family. And I do recommend avoidance of those for the first 6 months, at least in patients that are newly diagnosed. And the main reason is because of cross-contamination.
Okay.
There was a recent study published, and I believe it was the American Journal of Dietetic Association Journal.
Right.
And don't quote me on this. I'm getting ready to publish an article on it now, but I think it's 41% of randomly tested products labeled gluten-free had enough cross-contamination to do damage to those with gluten intolerance. And some of the products included buckwheat and some of the other what we call pseudo grains or pseudo cereal.
Right. Well, and I know I just happen to have that information right here. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But it's just as a preview, soy flour, for example, in that study had contained 2,925 parts per million, and that's technically a gluten-free. That would be gluten-free under the FDA guidelines. So that doesn't qualify as gluten-free as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Some people are extremely, extremely sensitive, and then you've got the people that maybe they're not symptomatically sensitive. But what about the silent damage?
Right.
I hear this all the time. Well, I don't react to that. I don't react to that. Well, maybe you don't, but what about silent celiac disease? We all know it exists, and we all know that it takes years and years for enough damage in some cases to build up to become symptomatic and to trigger disease.
Well, do you find that as the 2,000 patients that you've worked with, it seems like, I'm hearing a little bit more and more that people, they try gluten-free or you see articles on it, and they went gluten-free and they're just not getting better. The intestinal damage isn't repairing itself, and all these different things, even though they're following a strict gluten-free diet. Now again, like you mentioned, we don't know if maybe it's cross-contamination somewhere or whatever it is, but if someone is, just for sake of argument, there's no cross-contamination and they're still following that strict gluten-free diet and they're just not getting better. Now again, assuming that they're eating the other grains and things, is your recommendation, first and foremost, ditch all the grains?
Absolutely, because we haven't studied them well enough. There was a publication in an allergy journal about 14 years ago where they kind of came to the conclusion that why are we recommending rice and all these other grains, sorghum and millet, when we really haven't studied them? And that struck me, that the authors kind of said we find it peculiar, and I always like the wording of the way these things are worded, because how many people will that affect potentially?
Right.
It's like they nonchalantly put it. Nobody ever comes back and talks about it. When you mention a study that's more than 10 years old, people tend to scoff at it and say, well, that's 10 years old, as if the study were less valid because it was done 10 years ago.
Right.
But, yeah, that would be one of my first pieces of advice. Another piece of advice I would have would be to potentially have some tests run on the gut to identify potential leaky gut problems that may be contributing to additional food allergies, because sometimes gluten will induce enough damage that it causes a leak in the intestinal lining, and now we get food proteins that start to leak through and trigger and incite the immune system to continue to make them sick. And once you develop an allergy, until you heal that leaky gut, it won't go away. So a person can develop additional allergies, and so I recommend getting tested to see if those are part of the equation. And I also recommend having nutritional testing done, because as we know, in gluten sensitivity, malabsorption and maldigestion and malnutrition are major factors. And it's very rare that I see doctors measuring nutritional status in these types of patients. But my advice, there were a couple of studies done where they did 10-year follow-ups with celiac patients and found that they had high tendencies toward malabsorption even being on a gluten-free diet.
And why do you think that is? Do you think it? I've always thought always thought for the last year and a half. But I've thought that there's no difference, in my opinion, if you go from eating wheat all the time to then you go to the other products that are, still, the vast majority, it seems like, are still rice-based. So you go from eating all wheat to all rice, but now it's not enriched with anything. So it's, those types of products potentially, they're less nutritious. Do you think it's because they go from because they're eating all of that stuff as opposed to eating all the fruits and veggies, for example, that they should be eating? I mean, why is there that issue with the malnutrition and that kind of thing?
Well, I think there are multiple reasons. One is scarring of the villi, and so you have it's kind of like when you get a cut on the arm and it scars the tissue. It still heals, but it's not the same as your skin.